This week on Under the Radar, the never-ending hunt for racism. That seems to be one of the prime objectives of the Australian Human Rights Commission, epitomised by two new advertisements in their ongoing Racism, It Stops With Me series of ads. This initiative is proudly promoted by the racism hunter-in-chief, Tim Sopothasane. It's no exaggeration to say that Sopothasane is obsessed with race. He's one of those ideologues that thinks every organisation in Australia, both public and private, should reflect the racial makeup of society. For example, in his blueprint for diversity, Sopothasane takes issue with the lack of diversity within positions of senior leadership in Australia. Cultural diversity is nowhere near proportionally represented within positions of senior leadership. He then goes on to detail the shocking lack of cultural diversity amongst ASX 200 CEOs, politicians, the public service in general, and university chancellors. But of course, it's never pointed out why there should be an equal representation, or better still, why there isn't. It's just assumed it's some type of racism. In the case of politics, for example, what percentage of, say, Asian Australians run for pre-selection in their local constituency? Are they being elected in proportion to the numbers in which they apply? I don't know the answer to those questions, and I suspect the Australian Human Rights Commission doesn't either, because it doesn't ask those kinds of questions. It just applies the simplistic formula. Group A represents X% of the population, therefore they should be X% of every business or government organisation. It's the same formula the gender warriors use. Women are 50% of the population, therefore they should be 50% of every occupation category, except of course for the ones in which they are already the majority and the undesirable ones. And the racism hunters do the same type of cherry picking. Sopothasane even notes before the section on the lack of diversity in leadership that the children of immigrants on average outperform the children of Australian-born parents in educational attainment and employment. So will the Human Rights Commission take up the cause of insisting more Australian-born kids get a better education and more jobs? I doubt it. Now, I'm sure Sopothasane thinks this proves his point. Immigrant children are doing better at school, but that isn't translating to the top jobs in corporate Australia and in government. But could that have anything to do with the type of occupations certain cultural groups cluster around? Consider that in 2004, more than 1/3 of domestic university students enrolled in medicine were either born overseas or were born in Australia, but from a non-English speaking background. The numbers for dentistry and optometry were close to 60% of all students in those fields. Also, we know immigrants are more likely to be small business owners. Could it be that there are less people from culturally diverse backgrounds in politics as heads of corporations and universities because they're off being successful in other fields? I'm not denying that racism exists in Australia, but has Sopothasane even bothered to look for alternative explanations for underrepresentation? I suspect not, because he's got a one-track mind. And of course, if we're going to insist on equal representation across society, that will spectacularly backfire on the Asian student community. Earlier this year on an episode of The Outsiders, Mark Latham described this idea as the exploding cigar.
Last week was actually Cultural Diversity Week, and this diversity clam bake included Tim Sopothasane from the Human Rights Commission getting together with leading law firms in Sydney. And one of the partners there at Baker McKenzie, Chris Freeland, made the remarkable comment, "We've found an error in ourselves and we don't like what we see." Poor bugger's found out he's white. And what he's concluded is that, inspired by Dr. Tim, because 10% of the population has an Asian background, 10% of the senior lawyers should also be Asian. So Sopothasane is racing around now establishing racial quotas at law firms. Now, does he understand the exploding cigar that he's smoking here, Ross? Because if you're going to have a racial quota, we can point out that the elite selective government schools in Sydney, James Roos, North Sydney Boys and Girls, Hurlston, that Tim went to, are 90% Asian. So if you're going to apply a racial quota there, you've got to kick 80% of the students out to get down to 10. So too, a very high proportion of doctors and university students are Asian in Australia. I think that's great. If people are achieving these things on merit, great. But if you're going to start employing racial quotas, especially in selective high schools, 80% of the Asians are out. Dr. Tim, you are an absolute imbecile. This is self-defeating. You're smoking the exploding cigar and you've got to wake up to yourself. This is just dumb, dumb, dumb.
Now, I have absolutely no problem with Asian students dominating academic school results. If they work hard and get there on merit, Fair play to them. Why should they be punished for a lack of diversity? But I suspect Supothasan would be happy to overlook the schools and myopically focus only on the areas where minorities are underrepresented, because he can work himself into a lather about his favourite topic, racism. And so to the latest racism hunting ad campaigns that, according to the Human Rights Commission, highlight casual or everyday racism in a work environment.
Remain long.
Where to?
He's first.
Oh, it's okay. Take you.
No, it's not okay. He was next.
Now you'll notice that both here and the ad I'll show next that the incidents of racism are perpetrated by white males, because of course they are. Now I'm not going to say that this doesn't happen with taxi drivers. There was a case in the Northern Territory in 2015 in which a taxi driver refused to pick up two Aboriginal musicians. The Northern Territory Anti-Discrimination Commissioner Sally Sievers stated that while drivers may have had negative experiences in the past, legally they could not decide who to pick up based on stereotypes. She said such action would be unlawful discrimination and maximum compensation of $60,000 could be paid to people who were discriminated against. Ms. Sievers, who acts when people make complaints, said cases were usually settled through mediation before the matter was heard by her. And there have been studies about this in the US. Blacks reported being ignored by cabs twice as much as whites, and 55% of blacks have experienced a refusal by a cab service to send a cab to their community, presumably because it's considered dangerous. It would also be interesting to know, though, how often cabs get robbed, by whom, and where. There was a reasonably in-depth article on this phenomenon in The Atlantic in 2015 by Doug Glanville, a black man that works for ESPN as a baseball analyst and consequently does a lot of travel. He details a number of occasions when he was refused service. He then makes the comment, "It's worth noting that in my experience, the drivers who most blatantly refuse me service have never been white. According to a 2004 New York Times report, 84% of New York City cab drivers are immigrants. The vast majority are of colour, just like my father was in the mid-1950s. In 2011, the most recent date I could find statistics for, approximately 70% of Australian taxi drivers were migrants, up from 44% in 1996 and 62% in 2006. Australia's two largest cities, Melbourne and Sydney, have approximately 2/3 of all the taxi drivers in the country, and there's an even higher concentration of overseas-born taxi drivers, which is not surprising since that's where most migrants end up. So if you were to catch a cab in either Sydney or Melbourne, there's at least a 7 out of 10, perhaps 4 out of 5 chance you'll get a migrant driver. And if Doug Glanville's admittedly anecdotal New York experience is anything to go by, they might actually be more likely to be racist than your average white cab driver. But hey, it's easier to pin racism on whitey, isn't it? But perhaps all that is beside the point, because the ad tells you exactly how to deal with a situation like that. Show solidarity with the person experiencing the discrimination. Let the driver know it's not okay. Ironically, that is at odds with the advice from Supothasan himself, who actively solicits people to make complaints of such incidents to the Human Rights Commission. Anyway, let's move on to the next one.
Allow me.
Thank you.
I find this one fairly implausible. First off, why would you hold the door open like that? It's totally unnecessary. You can get in the elevator and hold the door open with the button. I mean, all elevators have these buttons, don't they? What, are you trying to impress the ladies that you can hold back a steel door that automatically retracts? When it comes to getting on and off elevators, time is the most important factor. No one wants to be stuck in an elevator full of mouth breathers longer than humanly possible. So I can see someone not being keen on opening the door every 5 seconds to let yet another person in, but the idea that you would do it to avoid being in an elevator with someone of a different race, for 30 seconds is ridiculous. You could imagine the same ad with the guy standing there holding the door open for both women. Feminists would then be up in arms about his benevolent sexism. I've worked in plenty of buildings like this. My pet peeve was when men would hold the door open for a woman standing at the back of the elevator so she could get off first, which meant every male had to squash themselves up against the walls of the elevator just so she could get out. Yeah, real efficient use of time there. But let's not go off on tangents about elevator etiquette. Now, there was an interesting reaction to this ad on the ABC's The Drum, a show notorious for promoting nonsensical ideas.
So the Human Rights Commission, the Australian Human Rights Commission, has just launched a new ad campaign called Racism It Stops With Me, sounds like a very high-minded sort of thing. But as we can see from this ad, they've gone about it in perhaps the most ham-handed way possible, with this whole sort of weird, moody suggestion that almost feels like some sort of fashion magazine ad or a perfume ad or something like that. But the end result is that we see this strange situation where a white guy is refusing to ride on a lift in an office building with a woman of color, an African Australian woman. I've been riding in lifts for 43 years. I grew up in a high-rise tower. I have never, ever, ever seen anything like this happen in my entire life. Now, I'm not denying that racism is a problem, but I think that the Human Rights Commission is drawing a very long bow when it's trying to say that racism is so pervasive here. And just some statistics from their own website. These guys, in the year 14-15, had 561 complaints under the Racial Discrimination Act. In the previous year, 429. So even by their own numbers, racism is declining. It feels to me like this is really an effort.
Racism is declining. This is a whole other subject.
Like an
Eric
effort
Jensen.
to drum up business.
Eric Jensen, just quickly.
You don't make complaints to the Human Rights Commission about casual racism. Casual racism is the fact that we have an all-white panel right now having this discussion. I mean, casual racism affects people's lives in every way. The ad is not depicting someone refusing to ride in a lift with someone. It's depicting someone not holding that lift with someone. And I'm certain that happens. Of course that happens. And it's not for you, James, to decide if it does or not.
Well, where do you start with this? First off, he claims that you don't make complaints to the Human Rights Commission for everyday racism, presumably because it's too trivial. But we've already seen, at least in the case of the taxi driver incident, you absolutely can. And secondly, the Australian Human Rights Commission has recently made significant changes to its complaints handling process to ensure that unmeritorious complaints are discouraged or terminated at the earliest opportunity, and respondents do not incur unnecessary costs in defending such complaints. This is at least partly in reaction to the notorious QUT case, which was arguably more frivolous than everyday racism, as there was absolutely no racism at all. As the explanation of the amendment notes, previously the threshold required before the Commission would accept a complaint was low, i.e. an applicant could make a bare allegation of unlawful discrimination and was not required to provide any particulars. The amendments to the AHRC Act raise the threshold in that it must now be reasonably arguable, well, that's not vague, that the alleged acts, omissions or practices are unlawful discrimination. Still, that doesn't give me a lot of confidence that everyday racism won't be reported. And how about the double standard of dismissing James Morrow's anecdotal experiences of using lifts, which admittedly is not the best form of evidence, and then asserting the exact opposite because he's sure it happens, or in other words, with absolutely no evidence whatsoever. But if you thought that was laughable, you're going to love this.
Well, I think that what you're looking at with this is the attempt to find racism in so many common everyday interactions.
Because it's there.
But
that's why we need to talk about it.
But what you're doing is you're saying that racism is the reason why absolutely every sort of thing happens. So you're looking for
racism is the reason you have a job. Racism is the reason I have a job.
Racism is the reason why we have jobs.
And as white
yes,
blokes,
it is. Structural privilege.
As white
Structural privilege predicated on racism is the reason that we all have jobs. Everyone on this panel has a job because they benefit from some kind of racism.
That was spectacular. So just remember, all of you whiteys out there watching this, you only have your job because you benefited from some type of racism. It's not because you worked hard, it's not because you studied hard, it's because of racism. Just take a look at this face. This is the face of an emotionally compromised, regressive weakling, plagued by a nuclear level of self-loathing white guilt. You can show this clip to your children as an object lesson of what not to be in life. This type of attitude and the obsession of the Human Rights Commission to find racism in every aspect of life reminds me of something Douglas Murray said in conversation with Sam Harris.
I've often said that with the modern left, since certainly the end of the Cold War, they've basically had a supply and demand problem. They want racists, they want Nazis, they want bigots, and actually, thank goodness, certainly in my society, I think in yours, they're in pretty short supply. And so these people have to find them. They want a supply of bigots and racists and fascists, and actually the supply is extremely small, and the people that they demand are too small in number to really give them enough of a political identity. So they stretch it out. They've deliberately used as offensive terms as they could, and used them of people that they must know do not fit that label. And I think the result is, by the way, among other things, that they have denuded certain terms of any meaning, and that this is going to come back and bite the left in a big way. And I can see this happening in Europe all the time at the moment.
So, have you been a victim of everyday racism? Well, don't tell me about it. Make a complaint to Tim Supomasan of the Australian Human Rights Commission. I'll see you next time.